Great discussion. Now I'd like to introduce a message from our sponsor, Alexion Pharmaceuticals. Please welcome Barrett Thornhill, partner at Forbes Tate.
Hi, everyone. My name is Barrett Thornhill. I'm a life sciences partner at Forbes Tate based in Washington, D.C. Today, we have Jason Shafran, Senior Managing Director and Economist at FTI Consulting based in Los Angeles. As you all know, the cost of drugs is a perennial hot button issue on Capitol Hill, and this Congress, as well as the White House, are currently stepping for more aggressive approaches to controlling prices. Jason is here to talk with us today about the merits and concerns around health technology assessments, particularly for rare diseases. He has extensive experiences, specializes in developing value assessment methods for innovative treatments. Jason, welcome today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Jason, before we get into the issues related to costs and HTAs, tell me more about rare diseases.
Great. Well, in the U.S., the Food and Drug Administration defines rare diseases, as diseases that affect fewer than 200,000 Americans. For rare diseases, about 37% of them, people have premature mortality. They die early, and most all of them, they have poor quality of life. Now, the Orphan Drug Act was passed in the 1980s, and that helped stimulate new treatments for these rare diseases, but over 90% of patients with rare disease don't have any available treatments. Some examples of rare diseases could be amyloidosis, which is a disease that causes nerve pain, affects your ambulation. It also may cause heart failure and arrhythmias. There's spinal muscular atrophy, which affects kids. In fact, for 2/3 of patients with spinal muscular atrophy type 1, they will die by age of 2.
Wow. So now that we know a bit more about rare diseases, tell me more about health technology assessments or HTAs.
Yeah, so health technology assessment, actually, that started in the US, surprisingly. So the Office of Technology Assessment was started in the 1970s as a government body. It didn't have any binding authority, and it actually was disbanded in the 1990s. But health technology assessment as a kind of binding government entity, that spread across Europe, Asia, Latin America, and in fact, there's now over 40 different HTA bodies around the world. And what does HTA do? They do 3 principal things. So first is they synthesize the value, the kind of clinical value of a new treatment. So, if they have a bunch of clinical trials and data, they bring that together and they want to measure what's the effect on patient mortality, does it increase survival, and on their quality of life. And they put that all together with a metric called quality adjusted life years, which economists like myself use to kind of mathematically measure the health benefits. Now, the second thing they do is they say, is these health benefits worth the price of the drug? So you want to try to quantify the health benefits and place a dollar value on that. And then is the price too high or too low for the expected benefits? And finally, the third thing is they may have some decision-making authority. In some cases, their evaluation on whether the price is right or not, well, that may just be in an advisory capacity. In other cases, maybe that will have a binding decision about whether a government or health insurer will cover the drug, whether there'll be more cost sharing for patients. So those are kind of the 3 primary things that HTAs do around the world.
So looking at rare diseases, what is the problem with applying HTAs? And moreover, why is it difficult to apply an HTA framework for drugs for rare diseases?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for rare diseases, I think there's a number of technical and also some kind of philosophical issues. So on the technical side, you have, because they're rare diseases, you actually have few patients, and so you're going to have small clinical trials. So you don't have, tens and thousands of people in the clinical trials. It's smaller. The evidence is typically not as good just because there's smaller patient populations. You also may have single-arm trials. You may also want to measure, well, how does the drug affect patients' quality of life? How does it affect how they feel? And ideally, you would do that in a way that's tailored for that specific disease. Obviously, there's not that many patients with each rare disease, so you're not going to get well-validated patient-reported outcomes. So that's hard to measure. You're either going to use a pretty generic measure to do that, or you're not going to. Also, often HTAs really just focus on value in terms of health benefits, but they'll ignore impact on health disparities in terms of whether a treatment can help get you back to work. Will it kind of reduce your functional status and your disabilities, or make those kind of easier to deal with so your caregivers and your loved ones won't have to spend as much time taking care of you and that burden. And finally, even if you're able to solve all those things, the market for patients with rare diseases is small by definition. So you don't have that many patients. And in order to be able to fund the clinical research that you need to see if a drug is effective, you're going to have a high price per person just to be able to fund that. So you have these technical issues, you have these kind of philosophical issues because of just the nature that rare diseases are very small patient populations.
So Jason, U.S. policymakers often look to how their peers across the pond are handling these situations. How have other countries been able to surmount challenges?
Yeah, that's a great question. So most countries that have HTA actually have a separate process or have some exceptions for orphan drugs that treat rare diseases. One example is a assumed benefit threshold, which if a drug is shown effective in a clinical trial, then they'll look at kind of what's the total cost to the country or the insurer. So you look at kind of the cost per person times the number of people. If that's below some threshold, it gets covered automatically. And that sounds like a really easy way to do it, but basically that is set pretty low. That's basically just a budget impact analysis and not an HTA. So that's kind of sidesteps the actual HTA process. Another one would be to have a specialized pathway. An example is in the UK, they have a highly specialized technology assessment approach where they have different standards for orphan drugs to kind of adapt to those. And while that again sounds good in theory, in practice about 11% of treatments for rare disease are not approved in the UK, and it takes more than a year on average to get them approved. So this is still a slow process, and not all treatments are kind of passed through there. And a third one would be pre-authorization programs, where if there is a treatment available for kind of a broader disease and there's some evidence that it would work in a rare disease, countries may pre-authorize the use of it, but those are implemented very strictly and not, it's pretty difficult to get through that pathway.
So I'm sure you have some real world case studies you could point to. Would you walk us through a few?
Sure. One example would be, or can be, for the treatment of cystic fibrosis. That was a treatment, it was approved in the US in 2015, but due to ongoing negotiations and the HTA process, it wasn't actually approved for patients in the United Kingdom until 2019. Another example is Spinraza, which is a treatment for spinal muscular atrophy. I mentioned that before. Approved in the US in 2016, and patients got access pretty soon after. In the UK, that was actually rejected in 2018. In 2019, there was a managed access program, which means that it was approved on a conditional basis, but only for a subset of patients. Manufacturers were required to collect extra data. And finally, only in May of this year was that actually approved. So again, in theory, HTA can have some exceptions that this would work well, but in practice, there are a lot of delays and a lot of back and forth, and patients are not getting access till too much later.
So tell me more about the utility of the HTA framework for rare diseases in the US, and also maybe highlight for us how the actual quality number affects these decisions.
Yeah, so in a typical health technology assessment, you're looking at the qualities gained, which is again a mathematical construct that just measures survival benefits and quality of life. And one of the key issues here is that most HTAs treat those health gains as the same for everyone. So if you had some disease for a rare disease with people that are in a wheelchair that are really suffering, and you have a quality gain of 2, and you have someone else that is a regular disease, pretty mild, and you had a quality gain of 2, HTAs would say, okay, well, those are exactly the same. We value them the same. But if you go to the research, you actually see that people value treatments for more severe diseases more. So if you can treat really severe diseases with people who are highly disabled, have really poor quality of life, and bring them back to normal or at least a significant improvement, those qualities, those health improvements should be valued more versus kind of the improvements for patients with less severe disease. And actually there's been some developments in the economic world looking at generalized risk-adjusted cost effectiveness to kind of account for that severity. But today, none of the HTAs really account for that in a rigorous fashion.
So Jason, I know economists can supply plenty of words on demand, but let's do a speed round to wrap up today's session. First, what is your best guess for when the US government would execute HTAs for new products?
Well, I think I'm going to be not as fast, but I think it's going to probably be take a while. I think there are some approaches where the government could have a kind of clearinghouse with health technology assessments done in the private sector. ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, is one entity. The Innovation and Value Initiative is another. So there's kind of different approaches that besides just having centralized HTA, you could also have HTAs kind of validating quality of these evaluations, and then payers could decide which approaches they use. So I think that's probably coming, but I think for rare diseases, because of all the problems we mentioned, that's probably a longer ways away just because of those technical and philosophical challenges.
Well, if you were in charge of this, what would be the first product or the first class of products you would target?
Well, I think if you think about what ICER is doing, they have an unsupported price increase method where they're kind of targeting price increases. And although that's not kind of the core HTA, most HTAs will focus on high cost drugs, which is high cost per person and affect a high number of people. Those are the things they're going to target. And rare disease treatments, although those are maybe high cost per person, those certainly should not be prioritized. Those are the overall budget, because it's rare, it's not going to be so big. And these are people with really severe diseases. So you would tend to focus on bigger diseases, more prevalent, more expensive treatments to make sure that those are priced correctly.
Great. Third, from a manufacturer's perspective, is a good offense on assessing a product's value the best defense?
Well, I think generating evidence to measure value broadly is key. So kind of at the time of launch. So you'll have a new drug, you'll have a clinical trial that shows it works well, and then you're going to get assessed. And one of the problems is maybe you don't yet have evidence on, well, will this help someone get back to work? Will it improve their quality of life and functional ability? Will this help reduce the caregiver burden? Will this kind of reduce health disparities? And that evidence, the sooner you can have that evidence available, HTA bodies or even payers, Medicare, other people will have to take that into account. So I think the sooner you can generate evidence on how new treatments affect broader societal impacts, that's certainly very valuable.
Interesting. Well, fourth, as you probably know, the Build Back Better reconciliation package that's passed the House and is currently pending in the U.S. Senate imposes straight price controls based upon the age of a product. Are HTAs better or worse?
So I would say, HTAs is just evaluating, what a treatment's price, could be. That could be done in an informative approach or not. But in both cases, if you have centralized government setting prices, that's fairly similar. HTA is, I would say, is superior than just kind of the age of the product, because at least you're incorporating value in a more comprehensive way. But still, both are kind of setting prices in a top-down manner and not taking into account variability in kind of what matters. Is it safety or efficacy, how those trade-offs are? What if we incorporate the caregiver burden? What about productivity? So I would say certainly HTA is better than just a very crude price setting based on the timeline. But again, centralized kind of price setting is not ideal in any such setting.
Gotcha. Well, last, here's the easy one: country or Western?
I'll say probably neither on both of those. I'll go with classical for me.
Fair enough. Any last remarks you want to get in?
Well, I mean, I think, one of the key things is, the Orphan Drug Act passed in the 1980s. I think that was certainly helpful for stimulating new treatments, but still over 90% of diseases, of rare diseases, don't have any treatments. And there are a lot of challenges on the cost front, but it is important to continue the conversation in terms of how do we continue to get access, how do we ensure that treatments are price to value, and I think that's kind of where we want to head forward together as a country.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for spending time with us today. Again, everyone, this is Jason Schafran at FTI Consulting, and I'm Barrett Thornhill. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much for that fascinating conversation.